Thank you so much for so much for joining us. This event has been coordinated by folks from the Student Christian Movement of Canada, Citizens for Public Justice, the Canadian Poverty Institute at Ambrose University, the Ottawa Campus Chaplaincy, the King's University, and the Coady Institute at St. FX. My name is Bailey. I am the National Coordinator for the Student Christian Movement of Canada, one of the organizations hosting this event. We're in a group of student groups across the country and an organization dedicated to helping students come together in community around sort of faith-based approaches to social justice and social justice-based approaches to faith. So each of us and our organizations are committed to walking in right relationship with the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples who have long lived on and continue to care for these lands all across Turtle Island. I know we're all coming from different places. I personally am coming to you from where I live, work, and play in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk peoples. And I invite you to share the names of your traditional territory in your watch group or to put it into the chat. So I'm going to gather us for a moment in prayer and then go through the agenda and get us started with our panel. So I invite you to join me in prayer. Loving God, we thank you for bringing us together in community, and we thank you for the right and responsibility we have to be stewards in our community and to get to learn from one another and to get to play our role in trying to bring about your kingdom on earth. Help us to learn from one another and help us to guide one another and our communities as we discern and plan for our next chapter together. Amen. So I'm going to just go over how tonight is going to go. In a second, I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to have about half an hour of a moderated panel discussion. So I'm going to ask some questions to our panelists. They're going to get to respond to each other's answers. And then as time allows, we're going to take questions from all of you folks. So definitely, if you think of questions, write them down, hold on to them. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. And then we're going to go out into sort of group discussions. So we'll have a discussion here on Zoom. We'll be in breakout rooms if we need to. And then you can be in discussions in your watch parties, either as a large group or as a small group. And then we'll come back together. We'll have one more chance to hear from our panelists on sort of a closing question. And then we will go out from here into our communities. And so I'm going to ask you to stay muted unless you have been invited to speak. And if you have a question, raise your hand, but we will mostly hold questions for the end of the panel. So we're gonna hear from our panelists first, and then we will have time for questions. So with that, let me please introduce, please let me introduce our panelists for tonight. So first, I'd like to introduce Dugafi Debalke, who's from the Coady Institute at St. Francis Xavier University. He holds a BA in History from Acadia University in Nova Scotia and an MA in Conflict Studies from St. Paul University and the University of Ottawa. He's a trained facilitator and third-party neutral mediator. Dugafi worked as program manager for the University for Peace, a United Nations General Assembly mandated university in Toronto, San Jose, Costa Rica, and New York. He also worked as a deep-rooted identity-based conflict resolution trainer in Ottawa and Toronto. For 3 years, he was an international relations officer at the University of Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown. He worked in peace education curriculum development, community-based research design, as advisor to the Minister of Federal Department of Ministry of Peace in Ethiopia in the areas of peace building and communications. One of his research areas is on the role of the diaspora in peace and conflict. DeGaffey currently teaches peace building and conflict transformation at the Coady Institute at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia. And we're very glad to have you tonight, DeGaffey. Thank you so much for joining us. Our second panelist is Emma Dixon. Emma Dixon is a daughter, sister, friend, and settler from Unamaki, meaning land of fog, otherwise known as Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. She is a St. FX student working towards an honors degree in sociology with a subsidiary in development studies. Emma is the co-president of both the Sociology and Development Studies Societies and an active member of the Elder Youth Alliance, which strives to deepen relationships among settler and Indigenous youth and elders with the guiding principles of, I apologize if I don't pronounce this correctly, Atuapmuk, two-eyed seeing, and Nutuk conservation laws. She is currently working with the Climate, Land, and Future Advisory Board to develop Nova Scotia's first ever land-based curriculum, which strives to promote exiled epistemologies and the practice of weaving Indigenous and social scientific understandings of the environment, alongside critical engagement with colonial structures and histories. It is Emma's hope to participate and promote a more holistic and ecological understanding of the deep relationality and interconnectivity among all living and non-living entities through a peace-building dialogue within her personal, academic, and professional life. Thank you so much for being here, Emma. We're really glad to have you. And thirdly, our final panelist is Natalie Appleyard of Citizens for Public Justice. Natalie is the Socioeconomic Policy Analyst for Citizens for Public Justice, CPJ, an organization inspired by faith to act for justice. CPJ seeks to equip and mobilize communities and individuals across the country to advocate for just policies in the areas of poverty, refugee and migrant rights, and climate justice using intersectional, rights-based approaches. Natalie uses her background in education to help convene, share knowledge, and build solidarity among a variety of communities and organizations. Natalie lives and grew up on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, along with her husband and 2 kids. And thank you so much, Natalie, for being here and for all the work you did to help organize this event. Wouldn't have been possible without you. So now we're going to go into our panel discussion. So how this is going to work is I have a main question for each of you, and then I'm going to invite the other panelists to comment on or be in dialogue with that answer before we go on to our next question. So my first question is for DeGaffey, which is so federal elections happen every 4 years at the latest, but this particular election feels different and is talked about as being quite significant. Can you share with us a little bit about the unique social and political context of this election? And are there factors other than the usual issues or partisan politics that you think that people should really be keeping in mind as we think about and discern about this election?
Thank you, Bailey. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me to be in conversation with you on this important subject and important issue for Canada and for the rest of the world as well. You know, when I thought about the question, you know, what one thing came to mind immediately, or that politicians usually are known for saying this election is the most important election in our lifetime. That happens every election. But for me, this particular election seems a very important and very significant for several reasons. First of all, for me, the primary issue, I will be focusing on the climate emergency. What is the policy perspective? What is the strategy to address climate emergency here in Canada as well as globally? That is the first priority. The other thing really what makes this particular election very critical and very important is the issue of multilateralism in the world. What I mean by that is the post-World War II multilateral structure, it appears to be facing significant challenge from different actors in different states, which is showing some kind of a Wild West kind of behavior instead of actually respecting and working along other nations and other member states within the United Nations framework. So that is another point why this should matter in Canadian election. One, because we are part of the global community. Whatever happens elsewhere affects us directly and indirectly. And secondly, it's hard to imagine the operational and the function of the world without some kind of global order. If every country is allowed to fend for itself or ignore international laws and norms and orders, and then we'll be facing a significant problem at a global level. So what can Canada do in that regard to really strengthen multilateralism, strengthen international organizations such as the United Nations, and even possibly exploring additional rules-based frameworks for the 21st century. So climate emergency, global multilateral order, and lastly but not least is how to address a deep polarization, whether it's happening here in Canada or elsewhere. Polarization, for most part, has become a political strategy, even in some cases attached to the certain political ideology. So what can be done within Canadian context here in Canada to bring people together, to respect each other's humanity, and to make sure that our political programs and our political agendas are not trying to harness division and polarization within Canada and elsewhere. So those three things make this election particularly unique and particularly important for me.
Thank you so much, Degafi. Natalie or Emma, did you want to reflect on Degafi's answer and or the question at large?
You want to go ahead, Emma, or do you want me to go?
You can start, Natalie. Go ahead.
All right, sure. Well, I really appreciate this broadened perspective that Degafi is bringing to the conversation, and I think, while certainly within Canada we've been talking a lot about climate change and the impacts of climate change and how they disproportionately impact certain groups. It is certainly a global issue, and Canadian policies are having an impact around the world, and more often than not, those policies kind of come back full circle to have an impact on the lives of people in Canada again. But I really appreciate this idea of the need to support multilateralism, the need to address polarization, and Degafi mentioned that this is sometimes like a political strategy, and I think in all these issues that we're facing, it's important for us to really look at the evidence of what's going on, the evidence of what works to address it, what are people's daily lived experiences, but also who are the bad faith actors that are using these to their advantage, or creating some of these phenomena. And so I think, just being aware that this is not just a benign system where, gosh, some bad things are happening, but recognizing that, there's some ill intent behind these things. And in response to that, I think, Jagafi, when you mentioned sort of the need for like some kind of global order, and strengthening multilateralism in unions like the United Nations, but also other structures. And to me, that makes me think of our human rights and our treaty obligations, right? That we have these existing moral and legal frameworks that can be a real guiding principle for us, that they can give us that existing framework to look at, how do we measure up in terms of our goals, what we see as the role and responsibilities of government and of institutions and of individual citizens, and people without citizenship. And so I think, that's what I'm reflecting on, is how those international human rights, respect for treaty, and implicit in that, respect for Indigenous rights in particular, around the world, but also here in Canada. Maybe that will make a nice segue for Emma.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and I really appreciate your words, Jagafi. I think I too am really focused on our climate issue right now and what's going on, but I think when Jagafi mentioned what's felt in our global community is like affecting everybody, and I think that's really applicable when talking about students, and I think that trickles down into that kind of polarization aspect that Jagafi was talking about. And I think it's really clear to see with what's happening elsewhere is very much affecting the entire global community, and I think that is, from what I understand of my student peer group and my personal reflections, is that is actually an incredibly difficult feeling to bear when going into our own elections this coming April. And I think it's actually it's polarizing students to feel reassured and feel protected and feel seen by our governing bodies and also all of our social institutions. And I think in regards to our Indigenous rights, I think I pull so much and I absorb so much from the people I've gained connections with, and the elders I've gotten to speak to when talking about the division that this causes, and the division amongst whether it be different political parties or people of different faiths, people of different values, and that division only can cause fear and results ultimately in isolation, which I think is again triggering this polarization and this unwillingness to kind of open up and explore these topics deeper, because it's incredibly scary and it's incredibly uncertain times that we're living in. So I think yeah, that's how I'm kind of reflecting in a student mindset right now.
Thank you so much, Emma and Natalie. We decided to switch it up a little bit, so we're actually going to open up, give an opportunity for questions after each panelist, but we'll also have questions at the end. So if anyone has questions so far for Jagafi or something that's kind of jumping right off of this, I will take those now. Well, we will take those now. And otherwise, I'll move into our question for Emma. But I'm going to give you a moment to think. Well, I get to keep asking questions. So this is for Emma. So your work with the Elder Youth Alliance, you strive to deepen relationships among settler and Indigenous youth and elders, and you're also involved with the Climate, Land, and Future Advisory Board, I understand, to develop Nova Scotia's first ever land-based curriculum. Do you want to share some reflections you have on this current election based on those experiences? And what are certain issues or considerations that you think people should really have in mind as the election approaches, sort of based on your context and what you have seen and been thinking about?
Yeah, thank you, Bailey, and thank you for the introduction and prayer that you led us in. I'd like to acknowledge that I am on Mi'kma'ki, the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people, who I have the deep privilege of getting to work with here at St. FX and in Unama'ki, my home. Our focus in both the Elder Youth Alliance and kind of shifting gears into our land-based curriculum has been our guiding principle of Etowaptamak. This is a concept developed by Elder Albert Marshall, and I encourage everybody to look into his work because he's incredibly wise and he's incredibly conscious of the wisdom that youth hold and the responsibility that we all hold going forward, especially with our climate crisis that we're facing. Yeah, the relationships I've been able to grow here have really helped me kind of develop a more calm, collective attitude, I think, towards these kind of ideas and topics. It's like I said, a very scary thing, I think, especially for this generation coming up right now, because it's in our hands. And I think something really beautiful that I've been able to learn along the way from my mentors and from our knowledge keepers and from our Indigenous elders within the group is that nature has a profound right that we as humans have a responsibility to protect, but we often get wrapped up in that human arrogance that we find we have some type of power over ecology, which just isn't true. And when you kind of settle into that idea, I find myself really, really reflecting. And when I get to hear stories from the people I'm in relationship talk about how our Indigenous culture here in Canada and across Turtle Island are some of the most resilient land protectors that there is. And I think their tenacity and their defiance in the face of these often violent governing bodies or often conflicting governing ideas is that time moves on and we will still be here, and there is that knowledge and knowing that we are here and will continue to grow alongside nature, but it's how we come together as a collective and how we step into our circle. And a really great piece of advice I've received is that start these conversations small in these groups and in these organizations like CPJ, and start these conversations and allow them to trickle into your daily lives and into your academic conversations. And from that, it can grow so much bigger than you can ever imagine. And look to foster peaceful dialogue, as DeGaffey talks about, because when we're dealing with such complex and divided issues, we have a tendency to get wrapped up in that individuality. And it's just really, really what helps me is centering myself in that knowledge that there's so much we're all connected to, and to pull one piece out, like the climate crisis and like the climate and environment issues that we're talking about is so important, but also to keep them in context of the larger issue that there is no future for climate justice, or there is no ecological prosperity without having our governing bodies recognize that, and without having our education systems recognizing that, and without our health systems recognizing that. They're so deeply interconnected, as are we all. And I think having that realization that there is no sides to these kinds of topics and to these kinds of issues, and understanding that we can participate in conversation and debate peacefully and learn from one another, and like I said, get to absorb all this beautiful information that of course is not my own and that I've collected from so many different people, that there is only one world and we are just one nation and we all share the same breath. And that is not just our human stance, but like of all ecology we share that with. And I think it's really important to consider that within these elections of who has that in mind, of that interconnectivity. And our coming together shouldn't affect the integrity of our land and of Indigenous land, that we are still, like Natalie said, we are all treaty people, and this has to become the center of our focus within these conversations, because otherwise they'll be completely overlooked, and division will just keep coming up in these conversations. And yeah, I think that's probably my main takeaway from these groups right now.
Thank you so much, Emma. I really appreciate your focus on kind of being in dialogue from each other and how you're sharing the learning that you have with us, and how that's, I think, a really big takeaway of how we just need to have be open to that more. Now I'm going to invite Natalie and or Dagafi to respond and be in conversation.
Natalie, you go ahead.
Okay, sure. Thanks so much, Emma. I also really appreciated your comments, and a lot really resonated with me, and I think again, like we talked about this event being a way to engage sort of our faith as well in our political engagement, and so to hear you talk about, you know, the profound rights of nature and the goodness of nature and all creation, I think of you know, that responsibility that we have to creation, and to see ourselves as part of God's good creation, with that inherent dignity, with that inherent worth, and that call to live in right relationship, that call to create the environment for all people and all creation to thrive together. I think that's you know, to me, that's such a important calling of faith, and it has such again such a guiding light for the way that we can think about our the way that we govern, the way that the policies that we choose, and the way that we engage with one another. And the other thing that you said that really struck me, Emma, is just talking about starting these conversations small and allowing them to trickle into your daily life. And I think you know, sometimes the challenge of these big, complex, interconnected issues is that they are so big. And one of the things that I like about the work of CPJ and many of our partners is that we are tackling them on this systemic level, because they're not just about, you know, whether you or I decide to recycle, but they're, you know, they're about what sort of systems and policies we have in place. So while I love that systemic level, I'm also very conscious that we don't get that systems change without the change and learning that happens at an individual level, without the Spirit's work of changing individual hearts and minds, which, you know, then ripples out into a community or an institution. And there's this interplay back and forth between individual people, collectives or communities, institutions, and governments. And so I think, yeah, that idea of letting these big ideas filter into the way we talk about complex issues, and letting those complex issues, you know, filter and inform the way that we have those one-on-one relationships and the kind of witness that we have in our communities. I think that was a really beautiful point that you brought up.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you, Emma. I concur with Natalie. What Emma brought into the conversation is critically important. How we look at our individual role, our community role, and our collective role in addressing these challenging and very important issues. One thing when I was listening to Emma really came to mind was for my work, I go to different parts of the world, and what I see is intergenerational memory gap. With that, in that context, what I'm reflecting is what is the historical precedent in the past that happened we can learn from. We can actually harness some tools and some practical approaches from the past, whether it's civil rights movement or any other kind of initiatives that have really brought communities together in the past. So in that sense, I think we have to be actively involved in bringing intergenerational communities, one, to share memory, two, to learn from the previous generation, how they approached challenging moments, challenging times in history, and also learn their wisdom. Emma brought up the concept of peaceful dialogue. It seems very distant and even impossible sometimes when you look at certain issues, certain countries, that peaceful dialogue is not a possibility. But what we're referring to when we say peaceful dialogue is humanizing each other. If we see each other as fellow human beings, and if we see that we all have same needs, same issues that concern us, then it will be probably easy to come under one roof and engage in a very civil and peaceful conversation. It goes back to my earlier point that there's a lot of dehumanization. There are lots of narratives constructed to other people. So I think that peaceful dialogue is very important as we go through this critical moment in perhaps in human history. The other thing I would like to bring a personal story here, which is in my office, I have two important items I keep dearly. And every time I walk into my office every morning, I look at them to remind me the past and also to help me envision the future. That is, one number of years ago when I was working in Ottawa, a friend of mine gave me a gift for my birthday. That gift is a piece of Berlin Wall. She happens to be in Berlin when the Berlin Wall was coming down. So she carried a small piece with her and she gave me a piece out of that. And the other, last summer, I was working with indigenous communities, Coady, and when I finished my workshop, I was surprised. One of the people from the indigenous communities gave me a white eagle feather. I put those two, and every time I walk in, I put myself in between those two. One is the symbol of division, a symbol of polarization, a symbol of many negative aspects, and the other is a symbol of welcoming, generosity, protection, care, and networking. So I think we have to, the reason why I'm raising this is we have to go back in history as much as we can and look at moments in history and also find practical hope and practical actionable hope that we can actually navigate through these difficult moments. So for me, it's very, very important that whatever political differences we have shouldn't go beyond political differences into dehumanization and hate and animosity. So we need something to keep us in line. And the story I was telling you is that it reminds me what can be done when people come together. The Berlin Wall came down, but at the same time, we have to keep in mind that there are lots of invisible walls in the world today. They may not be physical walls, but there are several walls. So our task is really, I teach peace building, and the simplest definition of peace building for me is building a relationship rooted in dignity and respect. Once you have that relationship, you are unlikely to go to violence and bloodshed and so on and so forth. So, yeah.
Thank you so much to Gaffy and Natalie. And now I think I'm going to turn to my question for Natalie. We have a great question in the chat, but I'm going to hold it for afterwards. So Natalie, one of the issues that has gotten a lot of attention lately in Canada, around the world, is the problem of affordability. We are hearing all the parties talk about the housing crisis, rising costs of groceries, as well as concerns about the impact of tariffs on jobs and the cost of living. Can you share with us some of the questions or considerations that you would want to encourage people to have in mind when they're speaking to candidates or evaluating party platforms or evaluating what people are saying about these issues?
Thanks, Bailey. So I think the first thing I'll say about all the attention that the affordability crisis is justifiably receiving is I'd like to just make a little distinction between things being affordable or things being expensive. And I make that note because I think one of the reasons that we're hearing more about affordability is that folks who hadn't been struggling with the costs of living as much are feeling the squeeze much more than they had been. And we've also seen a huge spike in the rising costs of living. So, we hear about it a lot more because more and more people and different groups of people are being impacted by it than those who had been before. But I do think it's important to make that distinction between something being expensive versus something being unaffordable, because something might be expensive, but you may still have the means to pay for it. And particularly if it's a sort of like a leisure thing, whether it's travel or I'm talking about, travel for fun, not not travel out of necessity. But I think you folks probably understand what I mean, right? Things can be expensive, but not threaten your ability to live and meet your daily needs or participate in society. So that's what some folks are experiencing. They're experiencing things being more expensive, but quite a few more people, and millions of people in Canada are really experiencing like a true inaffordability of the goods and services that they need to live their daily lives and to have their right to an adequate standard of living honored. So when housing is unaffordable, when food is unaffordable, medication, these things, when you do not have the income to afford these basic necessities of life, to protect your health, to protect your well-being and that of loved ones, then that's truly folks that are experiencing the affordability crisis. And I make this distinction because while affordability is getting a lot of airtime, one of the things I would encourage people to look at when they're considering different party platforms, or if you're speaking to candidates who are wanting your vote, are the solutions that they're offering to this affordability crisis, are they directed at those that are really struggling to afford the basics of an adequate standard of living? Or are their policies more directed at the folks who are actually, dealing with things that are more expensive, but are not actually threatened by this affordability crisis? And I say that because quite a few of our policies that are purportedly meant to address poverty or affordable or housing, the housing crisis, for example, are actually more aimed at the middle class than they are at low income people. And so I think when we're evaluating party platforms and candidates' responses, we want to look at, are we being offered an overly simple solution to a complex, deeply entrenched problem of inequity? Or are we being offered a tax break for people that, probably won't make the difference between whether or not they can afford a place to live and pay for food and pay for medication and pay for clothing or, a kid's birthday gift. So I think that's one of the things that I would highlight is just, these problems that we're facing today are, some of them have been exacerbated by recent circumstances like the pandemic, like tariffs. But if we think about housing, for example, we're dealing with the results of 30 years of federal divestment from affordable housing. So we have a housing market that just, has been neglected for 30 years, and we've only just started to see federal re-engagement there. We've seen wages and income supports that just have not kept pace with the cost of living for decades. So, often people are kind of balking at the upfront cost of dealing with these crises, but it's because they've been neglected for so long. So I would just say, let's look critically at any solutions that involve cutting public services or programs, because we know that those investments are preventative measures that actually save money in the long run. And let's instead look for solutions that will bolster those universally accessible, publicly provided programs and services that strengthen our social safety net, rather than further eroding it and expecting the private market to come in and save us. So I'm sure that's going to prompt some questions and maybe thoughts for folks. So I'm gonna pause there. But that's going to be my provocative response to this question.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I really, really appreciate how you're drawing a difference between like unaffordable basic necessities and expensive luxuries, essentially, and how we really need to be careful to pay attention to how people are talking about those things and not equate them. And I'm going to invite Emma. Do you want to respond to the question or to Natalie's reflections?
Yeah, I'd love to touch on Natalie's reflection. That was a beautiful response. And I think Natalie's comment in particular about being aware of that simple solution is detrimental, because there really is never a simple solution. And where one benefits, it's usually at the expense of others. And we can tie that back to the global community that DeGaffey was talking about earlier. But I also think that I'm always going to be able to tie these conversations back to community and back to relationships, because when we're facing an election like this and you're getting out and talking to politicians and you're asking really important questions and you are bringing a voice to those who otherwise maybe can't speak up at the moment or are otherwise preoccupied, I think it's also really important to take that concern and that interest and drive it towards, again, those smaller circles and really step into finding solutions, because like Natalie said, we can't rely on the private market. And that's something I think even the younger generation is growing so aware of, is relying less on social structures. And we are the COVID generation, so I find it even in myself hard to kind of step out of that box and into circle and try to build those relationships, especially in communities where your roots aren't in. But finding those connections and accepting invitations into groups like these and into community community like soup kitchens and cooperative initiatives and volunteer programs and get that experience, so then you can then channel that into your conversations, and you can bring the facts, and you can bring personal experience where maybe you don't struggle with the cost of living right now, and maybe you're in that privileged position as I am, but maybe you know others and you want to advocate from them, but you can't properly do so without first understanding a little bit of that experience. So I think being able to kind of touch in, like we said, to those systematic issues, but also always bringing it back to community, because that's where you have to build. And I think that makes me think of even Nora Bateson's work around the ecology of like people needing people. And when we are in terms of crisis, and when we are facing a poly crisis like this, where there are issues of affordability, and there are climate issues, and there are national security issues, and there are Indigenous rights issues, it's always going to be so important to build those, to fortify yourself, as maybe I've heard DeGaffey say once or twice, but to build that foundation so that when we are in crisis and when these issues arise, you have a foundation to fall back on, and you have social movements like this to connect with and share your voice with as well. So that's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Natalie, do you want to join the conversation?
I think you mean DeGaffey.
I do. I'm so sorry. DeGaffey, would you like to join the conversation?
No, I thank you both. You really articulated it beautifully, what needs to happen. And Natalie raised the point of complex problems of inequity that cannot be addressed, some kind of band-aid solution, and we have to connect the dots, going back to the climate emergency, going back to economic injustice, going back to polarization, going back to how to build a resilient and green economy. All those kind of things need to be connected. But one thing is becoming more clearer now, for me at least, community. What I mean by that is the challenges we're facing cannot be really fully addressed by top-bottom approach. We have to really strengthen communities at all levels, and grassroots communities, and harness their expertise, their knowledge, their spiritual exercise, social values, norms, and all those kind of things. And I think this is not just an academic reflection. This is really, really important, and I have seen it in many parts of the world, how communities are taking full ownership and full responsibility for their children's future. So I think we have to focus on communities in a serious way, and we have to self-empower ourselves as a community and as a group that is concerned not just about the temporary issues, but the larger future issues to our children and grandchildren. So, and we have one last point is we really have to be honest and go deeper in identifying the root causes of these problems. What are they? How do we address them? And let's look at it critically, as one of you said. So if we do that, and if we build that culture of community, and during the civil rights movement, Dr. King called it the beloved community, and the foundation of many things, whether we are trying to address equity, health, or all issues. So we have to go back those moments, how they organized, and even borrow their terminologies and their languages, and get our, for lack of better term, get our act together at a community level, and just take charge of our future.
Well said. Thank you, DeGaffey. We're going to open up for questions from the group now. 1 or 2 questions. I have a question from Ryan in the chat, but I just wanted to see if there are any other questions that folks wanted to pose to the panel. Okay, well, we will ask Ryan's question, which I think is great, and then we will spend some time in some group discussion. So Ryan is asking, and this is for any of you, what role do you think that financial institutions, central banks, and public and private debt is playing in the fight for awareness and change regarding the issues that we've been speaking to, like climate change, social justice, multilateralism, affordability? So feel free to jump in.
I am not an economist, or I didn't enjoy my classes about economics and finance when I was a student. But I think the question is very significant one, in not just a national, but a global one. The issue of debt is paralyzing many nations around the world. And there have been an active campaign to address that particular issue at a global level. And the financial institutions issue goes back to what Natalie raised earlier about moral and ethical and legal issues. How much financial institutions are roaming free or without any legal or restrictive frameworks that make sure that financial institutions are not running their own rules or writing their own rules. In that sense, what is the approach? There is, of course, there is a level of difference in each country between, for example, Canada and the United States. There are some firewalls in this country that delineate between regular banks and investment banks, for example. So what we need to do is keep those frameworks in place, but also keep the campaign on debt, particularly student loans and all those kind of issues that, students are coming out of college loaded with debt, that some of them are, after graduating from a university, they are working on a minimum wage. All those kind of issues are interrelated, and we have to really, as I said earlier, connect the dots and put pressure on our governments to really lift certain aspects of this debt on students and on those who cannot really find a reasonably good job to pay their bills and all those kind of things. So I think it requires a clear policy direction. Ultimately, these kind of debts are national debts. It's not just individual debts. If people are not earning and spending, then the impact on the economy is significant. But also, it's the responsibility of our financial institutions and our universities and our educational institutions to provide an alternative approach for the existing financial structures and financial institutions, and convince government policymakers to articulate a better framework for the younger generation in particular.
Yeah, I'll jump in also as not an economist, but someone who is certainly interested in the role of these actors in public policy and in the impacts on people's day-to-day lives. So I won't speak a whole lot to say like national deficit budgets or things like that. But what I will say about that is that I do think that, part of the role of government in creating the conditions for all people living in a country to be able to access their right to an adequate standard of living means that there are times where it's appropriate for the government to shoulder the debt that individuals cannot bear, and to recognize that, you know, there are times where government investments, public spending on the kinds of infrastructure and services and income supports that are needed for a strong social safety net, you know, those are so critical. And when we don't invest in those ways, we end up paying for it downstream through greater spending on healthcare, or criminal justice system, or you know, the impacts of climate-induced disasters. So I will just say that in terms of, you know, national spending, but I would also say that when we talk about governments having a responsibility to create the conditions for people to have an adequate standard of living, yes, that requires investment, which, you know, is, you know, that spending is not insignificant, but it also requires governments to use regulatory controls and to look at the ways that they generate the revenue that's needed for those investments. And this is where, as Degafi mentioned, you know, I think this lack of regulatory controls on financial institutions, and including banks, but other financial actors as well, really cannot be overstated. And then also using policies like corporate taxation, a wealth tax for, you know, wealth over 10 million, these types of policies that seek to create a more equitable distribution of wealth in our country, and to minimize the impact of these financial actors. So when we look at the housing market, for example, folks may have heard about the financialization of housing. And we're seeing that in other sectors as well. And what that really means is that private profit is driving up the price of housing, of long-term care, of healthcare, because these private financialized actors are coming in and taking something that is really essential for life, but they're seeing it more as an investment opportunity. They're seeing it as a way to increase profit margins. And so it's, you know, I'm not saying that any kind of profit is wrong. You know, I'm not saying that every business needs to be a social enterprise or not-for-profit. But, you know, there's a profit there. These increasing profit margins are, what's the word I'm looking for there? It's like a false inflation, right? It's not just the regular inflation of the cost of living. It's a kind of shift towards prioritizing these private profits without regard for the impact that it's having on individual people and communities. And so I think, again, the role of these financial institutions in creating these crises needs to be addressed, but also how, you know, like public banking or like credit unions or alternative structures could be used as well. And so I think, yeah, just keeping in mind sort of the that good government policy isn't just about spending and investments. It's also about those regulatory controls to minimize the negative impact of for-profit actors that are engaging in, you know, what I would consider like profiteering, as opposed to just, you know, making sure that they can have a successful business.
Sorry, Bailey. From what little experience I have in this kind of realm of finance, I will say that I think there's a bit of a trend within these corporations and financial institutions of mismanagement, or oftentimes lack of proper or local consultation. And I think issues like these, especially from again, like my peers' perspectives, of this like out of touch, larger than within our hands, like hopeless messiness that kind of causes a step back. in these kind of political conversations, but I also think there is a way to look at this of how we as a younger generation coming up and having the power to vote and having the power to be seen in some of these conversations of how do we reconstruct these institutions in a way that can continue to not dismantle the whole structure, but rather work within the inside to make improvements. And I think how do we provide education to those who feel that these are topics that are either too complex or not within their grasp. And I think that's a really important aspect when it comes to voter knowledge and having that experience of how do we participate in conversations that we don't feel physically in touch with, but where does that education come from, and where do these changes, and who holds these changes on their back, and where is that coming from, I think.
Thank you so much, Emma. So now we're going to go into some smaller group discussion. We're going to take about 15 minutes in small groups. So I think we will basically be one small group here in the Zoom room, and then folks who are in your local groups, if you keep yourselves muted and you mute your speakers, you can probably just be a discussion group there. But if muting your speakers doesn't work, let us know, and I think we can just put you in your own individual breakout rooms. Hello, everyone. So we're just reconvening, so you haven't missed anything, folks at CPI. So I hope you had a great individual discussion time. Gonna start by inviting local groups to share if you had any like really interesting insights that emerged, or a question that you wanted to pose that came from your discussion, anything like that. So a moment to hear from folks at home. Hello.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
We can. Hi, Ryan. Hi, friends.
I will try synthesizing some thoughts, but our conversation began with acknowledging some of the resignation and ambivalence folks are feeling about the election, of the kind of it feels like it's decided before it even begins, sense. But we're talking a bit, especially about the faith piece. We were talking about our Christian faith calling us to be globally minded, which DeGaffey was hitting on at the beginning of the panel. And we got there because we were talking about the whole elbows up Canada response to the tariffs, and we were talking about, is the response to threatening nationalism more nationalism, even if it's a milder form of it. So we were kind of talking about that tension, but what somebody brought up was how in the States there's been significant cuts to foreign aid, and those very types of that's potentially a problem for Canada with this election as well. And so kind of how as Christians we're kingdom-minded or kingdom-minded people, which means we're globally minded, but how we even have an opportunity through more localized politics to also make a difference globally as well. So it tied in really nice with some of the panel discussions, but it was a good local conversation here as well. Did that summarize it well? That's great. All right.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. Calgary friends have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll go into our wrap up. Oh, yes. Hello.
Hi, we had a good conversation here. We started off by really talking about the importance of community building and how that resonated for people here and the need for respectful dialogue. But then we got deep into a question about taxes and tax cuts. I'll turn it over to Copan, who has got some questions about that. Just speak.
Oh, okay. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, yeah. Great microphone.
Okay. I mean, I was the one who was curious about Carney and Poilev's campaign on middle class tax cut or tax breaks. And a lot of these breaks are going to be on the middle class, but where is the money going to be coming from when these breaks come in? With like with the government being worried about where its money is going to be allocated to, where is it going to be getting its money, you know? And a lot of middle class families who are worried about like losing their jobs. And I remember Ms. Appleyard said that a lot of these policies are catered towards middle class families. So what if some of these middle class families who happen to lose their jobs and fall below like the low income line or the poverty line, are they going to be getting this assistance and help? And I was also talking about like understanding where these millionaires, I don't want to be, I mean, it's hard to be to empathize with them, but it's hard with these millionaires where I understand where they're coming from about how it is unfair to be getting all the taxes and we're paying for mainly a lot of the social things that are happening, social programs that we enjoy. And so, yeah, I was just thinking about that from a Christian perspective, where we can't enforce our own morality onto people who aren't Christian as well. Just thinking about those things. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's really like stuff to chew on. I want to hear if our panelists have response reflections.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. That's a great question, Copan. Nice to meet you. I think one thing that I'll say first of all is that right now the tax burden is actually greatest on some folks in the middle class and the lower income brackets than it is on the upper level. So even though they pay more because they have more wealth, the proportion and like the impact on their lives is actually much less. So so it does make it difficult to empathize sometimes with concerns of people with great wealth. And so I think it's important to remember that like when CPJ and some of our partners like Canadians for Tax Fairness talk about like a individual wealth tax, for example, what they're proposing is like an increase in the percentage of tax on wealth over 10 million. So, you know, it's really like, I forget what the percentage is of people that would actually be impacted by that small increase. And it's like, it's not like an increase of like 5% on their taxes. It's like, it's a smaller increase than that. And the other thing that I'll say is that it's also, when we talk about fair taxation, we're not just talking about taxes on individual wealth too. We're talking about corporate tax rates, which in Canada were much higher 30, 50 years ago. So, you know, sometimes when we're talking about raising taxes, we're talking about kind of just like bringing them back to where they were before they were cut. So I think that's important to consider. And it's important to consider that when we do recognize that like some pretty significant investments are needed because we stopped investing earlier, right? And because our investments haven't kept pace over time. So yes, we can get a bit of sticker shock when people say like, boy, that program would cost us how much? And it is. It is pretty shocking sometimes. But again, I think it's important to remember, like, you know, just as often people would look at like an individual who maybe did not pay their, if they owed taxes over 30 years and they just never paid them, and they accrued more and more debt. And then, we're finally required to pay them. That would be a lot of money, but it's because they weren't paying them, right? And, maybe that's not a perfect example. And I'm talking wealthy people not paying their taxes here. But I just think, unfortunately, I think what we're seeing with these campaign appeals to cut taxes for the middle class is, that good politics over good policy phenomenon that we see all too often in elections. At the same time, I do want to say, when I talk about policies or programs that are being directed at the middle class, I don't mean to sound callous in that a lot of people who would consider themselves middle class are realizing just how close they are to being, like one paycheck away from poverty. If they lost their jobs, that maybe like they'd have enough savings to sustain them for the 3 months, and then they just wouldn't have enough for what they needed. So I don't mean to hide or gloss over the fact that people who have not been experiencing poverty are feeling closer and closer to that level of precarity. They are concerned about losing their jobs and how that will impact their ability to cover the cost of living and that of their loved ones, or even just to provide for their loved ones' futures, right? So I don't mean it to sound callous or disparaging to people who are facing those very legitimate, real concerns. But rather what the appeal is to make sure that, again, that the policies that are being proposed are going to strengthen the social safety net so that when anyone needs it, it's there. And these policies should be designed to address those inequities that are in our system in terms of wealth inequity. And we talked about debt earlier, and our current distribution of wealth in Canada has a very few people holding a great deal of wealth at the upper levels of the income spectrum. And then at the bottom, you have people that don't have any wealth at all. They just have crippling debt. So, tax policies are a lever that we can use to redistribute wealth, and that we can use to ensure that corporations are paying their fair share. And so that can be done through corporate taxation, but it can also be done through other types of regulatory controls where, you're requiring like a certain minimum wage or paid sick leave or access to health benefits. So there's lots of different regulatory controls at our disposal. Taxes are one of them that, most people don't love to talk about and doesn't get a lot of attention. But again, Degafi talked about the importance of looking back at the historical context and learning from history. And I think some people would be surprised to learn how much our tax rates had fallen over time. And that, a lot of the times what we're just calling is for them to be brought back up to where they were before.
I want to thank you so much, Natalie. I really appreciate that well-informed response. Given the time, I'm going to bring us into our closing. We might run a couple minutes over, but I hope that's okay, folks, because I think our last question is a really important one and actually really relates to what it sounds like the folks in Ottawa were discussing, which is there's a lot at stake in the world right now and in this election, but everything feels very, very enormous, and sometimes it feels overwhelming or even sometimes hopeless to get involved. And even though, we're told that our votes matter, sometimes it does feel like things are preordained, or that it's hard to see what the point is, or if there's a point in voting, or if there's something we can actually do about these issues. So I'd love to hear like a 1 or 2 minute response from each of you on what you would say to that, or how you view that in your personal life, how you kind of combat that apathy, or would advise people to.
Let me start. Just a quick point here. One of the things I think needs to be raised in this election, which I missed earlier, is we are living in a very volatile and precarious global situation. It's becoming very unpredictable. What could happen a week from today or a month from today, both in peace and security issues. I think that needs to be considered when we're talking about economics, finance, and so on and so forth. Some kind of cushion, some kind of safety preparedness at a national level and at local level. I'm not trying to be a doomsday kind of predictor, but I think it used to be regional volatility. Some parts of Africa, some parts of Middle East. It's becoming more global now, the volatility in terms of peace and security. So that's one point. The other thing, Bailey, that's the point that the apathy and hopelessness. I would like to go back to those moments in history when things seem impossible. I don't know whether who said it, but we cannot afford to be hopeless. It's a luxury, really, because too much is at stake. We cannot afford to claim apathy, that I don't want to get involved. This is not business as usual, particularly this. I may sound a politician, but I'm not. I don't like, to sound like politician. But it's not business. These are not normal days, and I think our starting point should be that. How do we approach when everything seems going in the opposite direction? And I think we have to harness, we have to salvage something from the past, from our ancestors, and indigenous people talk about this very deeply. So one-to-one conversation, engaging people in that sense, making sure that people are aware of what is at stake at this particular moment in history. Yes, in the past, we may have been a sort of displayed apathy and I don't want to get involved, but this moment, I don't think we can afford to play that kind of game. So it's our individual responsibility to engage with people, to listen to where they're coming from, and also just to raise the alarm and make sure that people are aware of the reality. So I think that's my final thought. Yeah.
I'd love to jump in, Bailey, if that was okay with you. I think it's exactly what DeGaffey was saying in such uncertain times, and as Ryan posed, that this decision almost feels pre-decided. And I think that we can do our best to educate ourselves and to stay engaged with conversation and utilize our vote. But it's so important at the same time to make sure you utilize that voice in any way you can, because these problems may stem from our government and from our social institutions, our world banks, and such like that. But the true problem lies within the silence. And if we allow that to happen, and if we don't properly educate ourselves or engage with these groups, and it can be so hard in these times to find the ambition to keep moving forward and to keep having such difficult conversations, or to find joy in this kind of change and resistance. But I think groups such as CPJ and such as SCM are groups you really have to rely on, and to, like I said earlier, to build yourself up, whether that be with your faith or with your morality or whatever brings you peace within these times, because the results can some ways feel out of our hands, but we will always be able to wait them out. And in that time, we have to make sure that's when we utilize our voice, and that's when we align with these groups and these community events and these community organizations. And when we are not getting properly supported by our institutions from top down, we need to start working from bottom up, and that's when we need to build connections and step into circle with those around us, and allow that to be what keeps driving us forward. Yeah.
I love that. I'm like taking notes, but I'll share briefly since I've spoken a lot. But for one, I think I would say in my own life, when I think about what has changed me, what has changed my attitudes when they've needed to be changed, when I've needed to learn something outside of my own experience, never discount the importance of a faithful witness that a better way is possible. And you can live that out in how you relate to other people. You can live that out in how you frame certain issues and talk about them, the types of issues that you support. So that's one thing I would say. And the other is that, elections are a really critical time to engage, but I feel like they're also one of the worst times to try to engage in substantive policy discussion because they are so hyper partisan. So I would just say, yes, please engage in the election. Please talk to your candidates. Please make sure they know what you care about, even if you don't need to be a policy expert for your candidates to know what matters to you and what you expect of them. So yes, please engage in the election, but we need that sustained advocacy between elections. No matter the outcome of this election, we're going to have to fight for the types of human rights protections, environmental protections that are so desperately needed. And so, and while I use the term fight, I think Emma raised a beautiful point that we also need to do that in a way that is sustainable for us, that's healthy for us, and that brings us joy. And there's a beautiful climate action Venn diagram by, I'm going to forget her name, Dr. Elizabeth. It's in the Poverty Trends Report if you look on CPJ's website. But she has a 3-circle Venn diagram, and it asks, what needs to be done? What are you good at? And what brings you joy? And find that sweet overlapping spot in the middle. And that's a way that you can engage using the gifts, using the way that you've been uniquely situated, and in a way that's going to be healthy and life-bringing for you.
Oh man, thank you, Natalie. Yeah, I love that framework, and that applies to so much more than the climate. That applies to everything. I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and I want to give a big round of virtual applause and thanks to our panelists. Thank you, Degaffy, thank you, Emma, and thank you, Natalie. Really, really appreciate all of the wisdom and learning that you shared with us tonight. And I know I'm going to take this energy forward into the next month or so of SCM's engagement with the election. And I hope that everyone else is able to take away something. I'm going to invite all of our partners to share. If you have links or things in the chat, I'm putting SCM's website and social handles. Love to stay in touch with folks. And just thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, everyone. And I'll just note CPJ's election bulletin will be out probably by the end of this week with some framing, some questions to ask candidates, ways to evaluate their platforms. And I'll put the link in the chat, but you'll be able to find it on cpj.ca if you look there. And I did put a link to an evaluation form in the chat. So if you can share any feedback with us, that would also be great. And I thanks so much to Bailey for moderating, and to Degaffy and Emma for being wonderful panelists. And thanks to each of you for taking this time out of your very busy schedules to be with us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a